WIOX is supported by Kimchi Harvest at East Branch Farms on Route 30 at Briggs Road in Roxbury. Experienced growers of organic vegetables and herbs selling authentic homemade Korean kimchi and banchans. East Branch Farms. Information and ordering for pickup at 607-326-6177 or eastbranchfarms.com. WIOX is supported by Home Goods of Margaretville, corner of Main and Bridge Streets in Margaretville, New York. Now carrying spices, flour, jams, mustards, coffee and tea, organic vegetables and fruits, and local eggs, milk, cheese, and baked goods. And, of course, cooking basics and tools of the trade for everyone at home. Home Goods of Margaretville. Open Wednesday through Saturday, 11 to 5, 845-586-4177 or hgom.net. WIOX is supported by the Slider Agency on Main Street in Margaretville, a neighborhood independent insurance agency educating consumers about safe driving and about coverage options. Open Monday through Friday, 8:30 till 5. More information at 845-586-2641 or slideragency.com. This is WIOX, Roxbury, New York, your all live and all local community radio station, all day and all night.
Okay, you are listening to WIOX Community Radio, live and local in the Catskill Mountains at 91.3 FM and MTC Cable Channel 20, and everywhere at WIOXradio.org, where it's easy to donate if you like what you hear. You can also get WIOX on any smart device through the radio.fm app. This is From the Forest, every Wednesday, 6 to 7 p.m. Talk about a different forest-related topic with Ryan and John. John, how's it going?
Oh, things are good, Ryan. How are you?
I'm fine. You know, pruning apple trees.
That's right.
Apple tree pruning season has begun.
For the next 3 months.
That's right. So, that's good.
Yeah.
You know, so far this winter, barring the 24-inch snowstorm, is similar to last. It's warm.
Yep.
30s.
Low 30s, mid-30s.
Yeah. But we'll see. Still got a lot of winter left. So, we'll see how it goes. We got a full show tonight. And we're going to be talking about managing deer and deer impacts with Cornell University's Paul Curtis. Dr. Curtis has a Ph.D. in zoology from North Carolina State University. He is the professor in the Department of Natural Resources at Cornell University. He has coordinated the wildlife damage management program at Cornell for the past 30 years, which focuses on reducing conflicts, economic losses, and human health and safety concerns caused by wildlife in both rural and suburban landscapes. His work includes wildlife fertility control and population management, community-based wildlife management issues, and public education. Dr. Curtis is also testing novel methods for reducing wildlife damage to agricultural crops and forest regeneration. Let me see if I can get him on. Are you there, Dr. Curtis?
Yes, I am. Good to talk with you.
Yes, thank you for coming on. Where are you calling from?
Actually, I'm calling from Florida right now.
No kidding. How's the weather?
Beautiful down here, sunny and 70 degrees. I won't mention what's going on in New York right now.
That's right. It's I don't know, 20s, right, John?
Yeah, it's snow on the ground.
Yeah. Yeah. So hey, what kind of deer you got down there? Have you seen those key deer yet? Aren't they those miniature deer?
Yeah, they're mostly down in the Keys, as the name suggests. That the deer do run smaller down here just because of Bergman's rule that the farther north you get, the larger body size animals tend to have. But deer around here definitely look a lot smaller than Adirondack deer.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember that from school, right, John?
Yeah, that's right. We talk about it sometimes here.
That's right. All right, so we'll get right into it. Give us a brief background history of deer in New York State.
All right, well, that's a long discussion, but I'll try to make it brief. Now, pre-European settlement, deer numbers were widespread across New York, but at generally low densities that you see in a mature forest, probably something similar to what the Adirondacks have today. During the late 1800s, they went through a very significant decline, primarily due to habitat changes, as much of the southern two-thirds or more of the state was cleared for agriculture and lumber production. And as the forest was removed, species like deer, black bear, wild turkey, other forest-dependent species tended to suffer, and numbers dropped dramatically. But with habitat recovery and intense deer management, good game laws in the early 1900s, deer numbers rebounded across much of New York State by the 1940s and 50s. And by the late 80s and early 90s, deer were starting to become overabundant in certain parts of the state, such as Long Island and the lower Hudson Valley, where the numbers were growing quite rapidly. As far as numbers today, typical deer densities across much of the southern tier would probably range between 30 to 50 deer per square mile in rural areas, and you can likely double that on the urban-rural fringe of some of our cities and metropolitan areas where deer get more protection from hunting.
So, go ahead, John.
I was going to say, do you see those deer numbers stable or declining or increasing to this day?
Right now, deer numbers based on DEC harvest statistics are relatively stable. We had probably the peak deer numbers in New York State occurred in the early, right around 2000, where deer were, we estimate probably about 1 million deer on the landscape in New York State in and around 2000. DEC realized they were above goal densities in many parts of the state, particularly southern New York, Hudson Valley, and they implemented heavy use of antlerless deer tags to take does for about a 4 to 6 year period, and that brought the deer herd down in many rural parts of the state. And in more recent years, those deer numbers have tended to be more stable. And that doesn't mean you don't see localized declines or localized increases, but if you look at a broad brush scale, deer numbers are lower than they were in the 2000s and relatively stable over the last few years.
How accurate do you think those deer harvests indicate or reflect population?
I think the harvest statistics work really pretty well in the rural parts of New York State where hunters have good access to deer. I think where they are less effective by far is in that, again, the more urban deer, suburban deer, where there are a lot of animals where hunters just simply don't have access to the deer. So harvest really doesn't track abundance in those situations when hunters don't have access to take those animals.
Yeah. Now, you talked briefly about the era of extirpation, which is, coincides with land clearing, I would assume, for agriculture, and then the era of comeback, which is up till the 90s, and forests regenerate. Do you feel that habitat is underrated or overrated in this whole story? And, it seems like we like to blame, or give credit to game laws and stuff. But to me, there's such a strong correlation between the habitat comeback. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Habitat is the primary driver. Game laws help protect deer and help protect does so they can reproduce, but you can't have deer if you don't have at least some forest habitat. So habitat's the primary driver that tends to cause changes in deer numbers. And we see that when we have things like local ice storms or blowdowns that come through and set succession back, and then you'll get localized pockets where deer are really abundant when you get that flush of new growth following a blowdown or a storm. And we've seen that numerous times over the years in New York State.
Yeah, I was just hiking on Forest Preserve yesterday, and high up on the mountain, and an American beech tree fell down, and as you know, beech isn't that preferred, but in our neck of the woods, things are so atrocious that there was tracks all around that beech tree.
Wow.
Just everywhere.
Definitely beech is not a preferred browse, but deer are going to eat what's available. Yeah. And when the preferred vegetation's gone, they'll start to take things that they normally wouldn't eat. At close to 200 deer per square mile, I've seen them eat barberry on the streets in New Jersey. I mean, that's ridiculous. Deer doesn't get any nutritional value out of barberry, and it's full of thorns, but they're going to fill their rumen with something.
So you keep mentioning deer numbers. Do different areas support different deer numbers, and when is it, in quotes, unhealthy?
Okay, unhealthy is a really difficult thing to define, but there are definitely large variation in deer abundance across New York State. The Adirondacks and the Catskills, for example, tend to have the lowest deer densities on average because they have a longer duration winter, deeper, more persistent snow, which helps regulate more northern deer herds. Also, those areas tend to have the highest percentage of mature forest. And mature forest will support deer, but it's not great deer habitat. They really do their best in more early successional habitats where there's lots of browse that they can reach. The deer can only reach up to about 6 feet in height, so they need a lot of shrubby type vegetation to feed on within their reach. And once you get to a mature forest with closed canopy, some of that shrubbiness starts to disappear, and the habitat's not as good for the deer.
What kind of deer densities do you see on typical forests like that?
Okay, if I looked at the typical southern tier New York State forest, we'd see deer densities in rural areas often ranging from 30 to 50, maybe 60 deer per square mile if you add a little bit of agricultural land in there to supplement food. When you get into the more urban, suburban fringe areas where you start to see residential development, a lot of smaller scale farms, less forest cover, more protection because of posting and land closure, those areas typically support anywhere from 70 to 120 or more deer per square mile. The place where I've actually measured the highest deer densities anywhere in New York State is in Suffolk County on eastern Long Island. I did a camera survey out there about a decade ago or more, and we were finding deer densities out there of over 200 deer per square mile in some spots, which is just incredible. And just the whole forest understory, what was left was primarily invasive exotics.
So to people not maybe familiar with deer and deer management, who owns or manages the deer herd?
Okay, we all own the deer in New York State. They're held in public trust and managed by the State Department of Environmental Conservation for all this. So deer is one of those species that, essentially everybody owns, but nobody owns, and the state holds them in trust and manages them for future generations.
Okay, yeah. And that would be the New York State DEC, right?
That's correct.
And a lot of people don't realize this either, but it's broken up into WMU still, right? And it's managed that way?
Yes. The state's been looking at different management approaches. Years ago, we were doing citizen task forces in each deer management unit, trying to gain stakeholder input on how the deer herd should be managed. But in more recent years, DEC has been looking at newer approaches and over large areas with aggregate WMUs, and they're still working through that process and testing to see how that will work, and hopefully it'll work well in the future.
And what is the issues that they're trying to resolve?
Well, the issues are essentially what we call deer-related impacts, and deer impacts are both positive and negative. For example, positive impacts are the enjoyment people get from hunting deer or viewing deer, or dollars that come into many rural communities in New York State during the deer hunting season when people come in from out of town to hunt. And then you have on the flip side of that negative impacts such as deer vehicle accidents, damage to agriculture, damage to forest regeneration, diseases associated with ticks that deer carry are all negative impacts, and that's what makes deer management so challenging. They have very high positive impacts, bringing hundreds of millions of dollars into the economy every year. At the same time, they have millions of dollars in losses to agriculture and forest-related issues that people have to deal with every year. So it makes it a real challenge to manage deer to meet everybody's needs.
I want to ask you about that challenge later on the show. If you're just tuning in, you're listening to From the Forest. Tonight's topic is managing deer and deer impacts with Cornell University's Dr. Paul Curtis. Paul, people who listen to From the Forest have heard us talk about deer. Why is it so important to talk about deer, especially in regards to the forest resource? Why should we even care? Why should other people care?
Deer have a tremendous impact on forest regeneration. Obviously, if we're going to sustain the forest for use for future generations, we've got to grow new trees. Eventually, we're going to want to harvest mature trees. There's going to be blowdowns and insect damage, all sorts of sources of tree mortality, so we need to regenerate those forests so we've got young forests. And that's where the deer impacts come in. They preferentially browse species like oak, maple, ash, some of the very high-value timber species that we see for both forest products and wildlife foods, such as acorns. Deer will take and make it very difficult to regenerate those trees. Deer aren't the only stressor in the forest. We've got other things like invasive species we talked about. We've got climate change issues that are dealing with. So deer just add another stressor to the system. And fortunately, deer are one of those stressors that's probably more easily managed than things like climate change.
I'm not so sure, man. This deer thing, I hope we're not talking about the same exact thing 30 years from now. What do you think?
I'm afraid we might be. I really am afraid we might be. It's a real challenge because of the differences in landowner objectives. Excuse me. Deer are managed primarily on private lands in New York State. And it seems like every landowner's got a bit different objectives on how they want to manage the deer on their property, even though deer are probably crossing many properties, unless you're a very large landowner. So it's those conflicting management objectives, or some people want no deer shot. Other people will like to see all the deer gone to protect their crops or to regenerate trees. And it's difficult to satisfy all those needs on a broad landscape scale.
I'm going to say something unpopular here, but I'm just not so convinced that deer can be managed from the top down. You know what I mean? I just don't know if the DEC can do it. It's deer live locally. They live in our backyards and stuff. And man, this is really difficult to not only monitor the mere populations, but to manage and match up the deer numbers precisely to the habitat. That's difficult, no?
It's extremely difficult, but I think it can be done at least on small scales. And again, the bigger the scale gets, the more difficult that becomes, because you got to deal with more properties and landowners. And the number of tools we have is also not great. Essentially, the only deer management tool that works on large landscape scales is hunting. And hunting alone usually can't get deer numbers to the point where you're going to see successful regeneration on many properties. I mean, we've tried all sorts of hunting programs on our not teaching and research forest that Cornell manages, and we've had earn a buck. We've given out essentially unlimited antlerless tags, and we still see deer pressure to forest regeneration. It seems like hunting alone, we can't harvest enough deer to see the regeneration where we want it.
And why do you think that is? Hunters just aren't willing to take enough, or what's going on?
In some cases, hunters aren't willing to harvest female deer, which is the key, but that's not in all cases. Even on our forest, with Ernabuck, we were requiring our hunters shoot 2 female deer before we give them a buck tag, using the buck as the carrot, so to speak. And the hunters really liked the program and worked hard to take those 2 female deer. But deer became more and more difficult to get. They became harder to hunt, and we just couldn't get densities down to probably that 10 to 12 deer per square mile where we wanted them, where you're pretty much assured good forest regeneration of the soils and silviculture, right?
Plus, what about time? How much time does it take the average hunter to successfully harvest a deer?
You probably don't want me to start talking about hours, but we're looking on averages in our Cornell deer hunting program on and around campus, and the average number of hours per deer harvested that a hunter has to put in seems to be about 70 to 80 hours per deer during normal gun or bow hunting.
Yeah, see, this is my problem, is that the DEC is relying upon a resource, mainly hunters, which is recreational, to take care of a biological problem, and they're expecting it for free. And it's kind of weird. At some point, the reason why, John, I know why you don't harvest more deer, and I know why I don't, because of time, limited time and resources. But if you were paid, maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah, that opens a whole new can of worms. David Drake and others had the paper several years ago about, is it time to look at commercializing deer take to deal with hotspots of overabundance, and that got really mixed reviews in the profession. There were some biologists that were fully behind it and supportive and wanted to try it experimentally, and there were other biologists that were adamantly opposed to it because, it just doesn't fit the North American model of wildlife management and what we've done for years. And so it's an idea. It's being discussed. Is it going to happen anytime soon? I kind of really doubt it. I don't think the political will is there. You'd have to change a number of state laws and regulations in order to be able to take deer and sell venison commercially.
Yeah. I mean, anything's possible. 10 years ago, legalizing marijuana was unheard of. I'm just saying.
Definitely change could happen.
I mean, who knows? It's just, to have 85% of our meat in restaurants that's deer meat come from New Zealand, to me, is atrocious. 85%.
Yeah, definitely. We've definitely got a protein resource on the landscape, and there are definitely places in New York where they're overabundant, where taking hundreds of deer would help folks meet their management goals. But boy, there's a real challenge from the political side, because you're going to get pushback from hunters. Because again, we all own those deer. Hunters don't want somebody taking their animal.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, like Tom Eberlein, we had him from the University of Wisconsin, and everyone, it seems like we're always talking about Sweden or something, You ever notice that, John? But in this case, I will talk about them. You are allowed to sell a moose, but it's still controlled by the state biologists. They still cap the numbers,
Yeah, I think it could be done here, but in fact, there was some legislation proposed in New Jersey to do that a couple of years ago, but it didn't make it through the legislature. So I don't know. We'll just have to see if some state can get the political gumption together to make it happen.
Well, that's just sorry to go in the weeds there, but if you're just tuning in, you're listening to From the Forest, and tonight's topic is managing deer and deer impacts with Cornell University's Paul Curtis. Up next, we'll ask Paul about how deer impacts are measured.
Shining, I was a lady in bed, wondering if she had changed it all, if her hair was still red. Her folks said that our lives together sure was going to be rough. They never did like Mama's homemade dress, Papa's banquet wasn't enough. And I was standing on the side of the road, rain falling on my shoes, heading out for the East Coast. Well, I paid some dues to getting through. Tangled up in blood. Was married when we first met, soon to be divorced. I helped her out of a jam, I guess, but I used a little too much force. We drove back car as far as we could, abandoned it out west. Split up on a dark set night, both agreeing that it was best. She turned turned around to look at me. As I was walking away, I heard her say over my shoulder, we'll meet again someday on the avenue. Tangled up in blood. In the great North Woods, working as a cook for a spell, but I never did like it all that much, and one day the axe just fell. So I drifted on down to New Orleans, where I happened to be employed, working for a while on a fishing boat right outside of Delacroix. But all the while I was all alone, the past was close behind. I seen a lot of women, but you never escaped my mind, and I just grew tangled up in blue. Well, she was working at the top of the barn. I stopped in for a beer. I just kept looking at the side of her face in the spotlight so clear. And later on, as the crowd thinned out, I was just about to do the same. She was standing there in back of my chair, said, "Don't I know your name?" I muttered something under my breath. She studied the lines of my face. I must admit I felt a little uneasy when she bent down to tie the laces of my shoes. Tangled up in blue. Tangled up in blue.
Charlie Daniels singing Tangled Up in Blue? What?
Oh?
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to From the Forest every Wednesday, 6 to 7 p.m., and tonight's topic is managing deer and deer impacts with Cornell University's Dr. Paul Curtis.
So, Paul, we've talked a little bit about deer densities and their impacts on the forest in a negative way, regeneration and browse. How is this all measured? How do we go in the forest and understand what's going on?
There's several different ways, and there's no one that probably is the single best. Each has its advantages and disadvantages. For example, Baron Blossey's developed an oak sentinel seedling method, which uses planted oaks to each year to look at survivorship of those oaks. Oaks are favored browse by deer. Tom Erwinski developed a 10 tallest seedling method, where you go out and set up plots and measure the height of the 10 tallest seedlings and go back and measure those plots repeatedly to see if trees are growing or they're not. Don Waller has a twig growth measurement method, and I've worked with folks from DEC and ESF to develop what we call AVID, assessing vegetation impacts from deer. AVID uses tags, either seedlings or wildflowers, to evaluate plant survival and growth over time.
And this is mostly geared towards landowners, right? So people can do it in their own woods and without supervision of a maybe Cornell or a university?
Definitely. Our goal is to get as many landowners as possible that want to use avid plots. And if folks want more information about the procedure or to sign up to do avid inventories on their own property, they can go to our website, aviddeer.com, and sign up. What you do is create circular plots in the forest, pick species that you have at the ground layer that tends to be abundant, tag seedlings, and then follow their height growth again over time. And so we try to make it simple enough so that any landowner within a couple hours can quickly go out and put up plots. but yet provide enough detailed information on individual seedlings so we can look at tree growth and survivorship over time.
Do you focus on preferred browse or non-preferred browse, or both?
Actually, we try to do both because we get different measures. It's nice if you've got preferred browse available. If you've still got oaks in your understory, you've still got maples. When those, it's nice to know that you've got deer densities low enough where you can see those tree seedlings starting to grow again. But some forests are so heavily impacted that those species are just no longer at the ground layer, and so you've got to measure things like beech or something else that's less preferred. So you can do either preferred or non-preferred, and trying to get a mix of both is sometimes best. When even your beech seedlings won't grow, then you know you've really got a problem in your forest when deer are really starting to hammer the non-preferred species.
Yeah, we see that constantly all over the place. What's the timing of this? Is it a fall or a spring thing, or does it matter?
Actually, it's best done in summer. For the wildflower part, it's best done in spring. Probably the month of late May, early June time frame is the best because that's when the spring wildflowers are most abundant. That gives that sort of a drawback because you've got a fairly narrow window when you can really go out and see those plants flowering. Seedlings can be done any time during the summer once you've got leaves on the seedlings, so they're more easy to identify. But we try to encourage landowners to go out and check their plots about the same time each year within a week or two so that we can get a sort of an annual increment of growth of the seedlings, and that's what we're trying to evaluate. So you've tagged a certain number of maples. What were they in 2019, what were they in 2020, and then this summer again in 2021 we'll measure those same seedlings to see how fast they're growing or if deer are impacting them. And we also encourage our landowners to put up a small piece of fencing if they can afford it, something simple and inexpensive just to protect a small area so they can measure a few seedlings protected from deer in the same area to see how quickly they can grow if there weren't any deer browsing in the area. And what we see, and often our protected seedlings on the same sites are growing 5 to 10 times faster than the unprotected seedlings. So deer do have very clear and measurable impacts.
Yeah, it's easy to look up a photo. It's very dramatic of some of those fences and the results in just a few years. Now, you've been measuring your own avid plots in the Arnott Forest for several years now, right? What are you finding?
Yeah, we're finding that, again, we still have significant deer impacts at the Arnott, that outside of protected areas, our seedlings, our maples, our oaks are, for the most part, growing less than an inch per year. And like I said, we're seeing sometimes 5 or more times that amount of growth in areas where they're protected. So we've still got to do a better job of managing deer despite all the work we put into deer harvest. At the Arnott, we're also experimenting now with slash fencing, something that's sort of a newer model, newer technique where when you go in and do a forest harvest, you take the less markable tops and timber that would normally be left on the ground and pile it in a large perimeter fence, 10 foot high, 20 feet wide, all around the perimeter of the cut that creates a barrier that deer can't cross. And over time, our goal is that two things. One, that we won't have to manage that fence. We don't have to repair that type of fence that you would with typical fencing. There's a blowdown or a tree falls on it, and it'll naturally deteriorate on its own over the next 10 to 20 years so that we don't have to worry about doing any follow-up maintenance. It'll essentially go back to ground level at some point. And during the time when the wall is available, it creates wildlife habitat. It creates brushy shrub areas for things like rabbits and ground nesting birds, turkey nesting habitat. So we hope it'll show not only protection of seedlings from deer inside the fence, but benefits to some other wildlife species that use the brushy cover.
It's been 3 or 4 years now since you built that slash wall. Am I right?
The first one went in about 4 years ago, and we're seeing really significant growth of seedlings inside the slash wall now. We're very optimistic. We've seen just a couple of deer breaches so far and had to go up and do some patching and repairing, but for the most part, the slash walls have held up well for 4 years. If we could get another 4 years out, and I think we've met our management goal.
Wow, amazing. Yeah, I know. I saw that stand when it was first marked before it was harvested and the slash ball went in. And it was kind of a taboo thought. I remember Peter Smaller just asking the group, well, what do you guys think of this? There's a group of foresters walking it, and that was mixed results. So I'm glad it happened, and some research is done.
What are the impacts of deer in the Catskills compared to the rest of the state? How do we fare here?
Well, unfortunately, the Catskills has a high number of deer impacts. Even though you have relatively low deer density compared to places like the Hudson Valley, lower elevation areas in the Hudson Valley, not that far away, the impacts are still high. Some of the properties I walked there, it's just amazing how low is that ground level in the understory. And it doesn't take many deer per square mile to have significant impact when you're in places like the Catskills or the Adirondacks, where you've got a relatively short growing season. Your soils probably aren't the best as they are in other parts of the state, and so the trees tend to grow a little bit more slowly. So a few deer can have significant setbacks on regeneration. I worked on some places in the Adirondacks around Old Fort, similar to some Catskill sites, and we were seeing deer densities there of 7, 8 to 10 deer per square mile, significantly set back regeneration on those properties. It's just amazing how few deer can be on the landscape at times. And so, you'll read the literature, it'll say, well, if you under 15 deer per square mile or under 12 deer per square mile, you should get adequate hardwood regeneration if you're doing the right silviculture. Well, yes, that's true if you've got good open stands on good quality soils with longer growing seasons, but that doesn't hold true necessarily in the Catskills and the Adirondacks in New York.
Yeah. I mean, we have some nice, well-drained, rich soils for trees, not for growing crops, but I think we still have a problem, especially on south-facing slopes, right, John, where there's even less snow to knock back the deer. I've always noticed on north-facing slopes in the Catskills, it seems like the browse is always less, and you get better regeneration, if any, but better than the south-facing slopes.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, probably those south-facing slopes probably track the deer during that spring, fall when they're really hungry, and so that they can see where they would damage more at that time of year.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the forest preserve in that way, to me, kind of foreshadows things to come in some areas, I mean, we have an older forest than the rest of the state.
Yeah, when you've got old forest, you're typically going to have lower densities, and the silviculture is not easy, too, to really try to get ahead of deer. I know folks at ESF, faculty there, were looking at trying to overwhelm deer with browse in the Adirondacks, and size of the cut was really important, that you had to get 25, 50-acre cuts in some cases to get enough flush of regeneration at ground level to even overwhelm relatively low Adirondack deer densities. When you get down into lower Hudson Valley, in the lower Greene County, even in the northern Rockland, northern Westchester County, the deer densities are so high there, even if you were able to cut large enough areas, I think they would still get ahead of whatever regeneration was there.
Yeah. You need more sunlight, but I don't know. That might be too much for people to culturally tolerate. If you're just tuning in, you're listening to From the Forest, and tonight's topic is managing deer and deer impacts with Cornell University's Paul Curtis. Up next, we'll ask Paul about the role of deer hunting in managing deer.
Wrapped up like a deuce, another runner in the night. Blinded by the light. Wrapped up like a deuce, another runner in the night. Blinded by the light. Wrapped up like a deuce. stuff. Told me I got what it takes. She said I'll turn you on, son, into something strong. Play the song with the funky break. And go-kart Mozart was checking out the weather chart to see if it was safe outside. And little early birdie gave my in his curly-whirly and asked me if I needed a ride. Another runner in the night, blinded by the light. Wrapped up like a douche, another runner in the night, blinded by the light. Wrapped up like a douche, another runner in the night, in the dark with the monsters, the eyes, less than fun, wrapped up like a douche, another runner in the night, with the ball on my shoulder, the babe is kinda older, I track the douche, and go round with his flabby leaves and his knees and weeds and the empty crash to the ground. I'll start with a slingshot and line. They found a tender spot over his land. As a bloodshot, forget-me-not ladies with it as I take the buckshot turn of the band. Some sound like the sister with the manager, mister. May I got what it takes. She said, I'll turn you on, sonny, to something wrong. She got down, but she never thought she's gonna make it through the night.
All right, so that song, Blinded by the Light, you've probably heard a million times, and I looked up the meaning of it. No one knows what it's about.
Good story.
Yeah. So, yeah, apparently it was written by Bruce Springsteen. I didn't know about that, and no one knows what he's talking about. So if you're just tuning in, this is From the Forest every Wednesday. Tonight's topic is managing deer and deer impacts with Cornell University's Dr. Paul Curtis. What's the role of deer hunting in managing deer?
Well, hunting is the primary management tool that state wildlife agencies use to try to keep deer abundance in balance with their forest habitat. And it's really the only tool that we've got that works at a landscape scale. And hunting works relatively well, I think, in rural parts of New York State where hunters have good access to deer, and on those properties where hunters are willing to take female deer. It does no good to do bucks-only hunting because that's going to do nothing, really check deer population growth and impact. So hunters need to be willing to take female deer to try to slow down population growth the best that they can.
Go ahead, John.
I was going to ask, I mean, this might be jumping the gun just a hair, but how are other states doing with their role as hunters and deer impacts on their landscapes? Do you have any idea? And not just surrounding states, like not Massachusetts, New Jersey, but states like us that big and broad like New York State is.
Like PA or something?
PA, Wisconsin,
yeah.
Ohio, maybe.
Michigan,
yeah, exactly.
All these states are facing similar challenges trying to do what they can to manage deer impacts and recruit hunters. But hunter numbers have been on a long-term decline, you're probably well aware. That changed a little bit just the last couple of years with people out of work and with online hunter safety testing this year and DEC offer with COVID. But if you look at long-term trends, we've got lots fewer hunters than we used to. The hunter population's aging. The average age in New York and Pennsylvania hunters is 55 plus nowadays. So the writing's on the wall that we've got fewer hunters, and we have fewer young hunters, particularly that are willing to get to the high elevation backwoods areas where some of these deer are hanging out and causing damage. So hunting is a management tool. It's necessary. We can't manage deer without it, but it's not working as well as we'd like to in many cases.
All right, so let's say recreational hunting. It sounds like it's not looking good, which is sad for me. I'm a recreational hunter. Okay, so here's a tough question. So what are your alternatives?
What's the future?
Crystal ball time.
Yeah, the crystal ball, it's really tough to say what the future is going to be. I think we're going to continue to be facing any of these long-term trends in deer impacts. That's why we're trying to collect data with AVID and other methods at a landscape scale so we can really see what's happening on the ground. The question is going to be, even if we show that the deer are causing impacts to regeneration, which they are, is there enough of a will from hunters? Is there enough support from the State Wildlife Agency to really knock deer numbers down to what it takes to regenerate trees? And even then, it's not a simple solution because, again, we talked about other stressors. Well, we also see legacy effects from deer. There are good data that show that even if you can knock deer numbers down to that 8 to 10 to 12 deer per square mile and keep them there for a few years, that some of these overbrowsing impacts on the landscape really continue for a decade or more afterwards. You can still measure those impacts. So it's not going to be a quick recovery, which makes it even all that much more challenging.
And are there other things that people are doing? Like I know Vassar College had sharpshooters. Did they have sharpshooters?
I believe they did. People have tried all around New York and other states have looked at culling and sharpshooting. And those techniques are very effective, but they're only on a small scale. You can only afford to do so much. Typically in a culling program, it'll cost between, anywhere from $300 to $500 per deer removed in a sharpshooting program, depending how it's done and who's doing the work. And so that's pretty expensive on a per deer basis. And given the densities that we see, many areas 2 or 3 square miles in size, you literally have to remove hundreds of deer. I know we've got a culling operation going on up at Fort Drum right now with USDA Wildlife Shooter Services sharpshooter, and they've taken well over 400 deer just out of the cantonment area the last couple of years, and they're just starting to make a dent in the deer herd now. So you're talking about, even on small areas, removing hundreds of deer in many cases, so it gets to be a very expensive proposition.
And even that, are you just creating a vacuum for other deer to go into those areas, fill that spot?
Well, deer don't behave like gas molecules. I mean, they've got a social structure, but they do move on the landscape. Some of our tag deer from our Fort Drum research, we've had one of our bucks, I think we marked in 2016, was killed 2 years later in Ontario, Canada. We had a doe that we tagged on Fort Drum that was seen on a trail camera by 120 miles northeast of Fort Drum. So you get occasional long-distance movements of some of these animals. But most deer live and die within 10 to 15 miles of where they were born.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I know it's a small-scale thing like Vassar did, but I think what we're really talking about here is incentives. I mean, hey, if the government or the D.C. had to make sure that everyone's lawn got mowed, it would be a logistical nightmare. But somehow we get it done, right? Somehow from the bottom up, people get their lawns mowed, and they plow their driveways. Now, I know you're in Florida, but you know what I'm saying? Like, think about all the small-scale plowing that happens every time it snows. I think we can do better than this. I just think doing this top-down is just it's never going to work. It's so inefficient. I don't know. There's got to be another way.
But coming from the bottom up, you got challenges too. You're going to have to get how many different landowners on board and have them all agree to be doing the same thing, and that's where the real difficulty comes in. Is that average doe's home range is 150 acres, so depending where you're at, that she could be crossing 3 or 4 properties, or she could be in suburbia. She might be crossing 150 properties.
Sure.
Who knows?
Oh yeah.
And so all those landowners got to come to some agreement that we're going to do X, and then get on board with it and be willing to fund it. And that gets to be really difficult.
Well, no, it wouldn't have to be funded. It wouldn't have to be funded. Not if you are incentivizing hunters and privatizing a part of it. But at least it wouldn't cost taxpayers anything. And you know what? I feel like the diversity of landowners can be a good thing. Some landowners are not going to want hunting, and that's their right. And guess what? That's fine. That area won't be hunted. But right now, I think we can agree it's not working. It's not working.
Yeah, definitely that we're not meeting in goals in some part of the state in forest regeneration is suffering in some parts of the state. So the question is, can we get enough political will to change laws and regulations to the point that we can incentivize folks? And that's a tough hurdle, too.
Yeah. What do you think, John?
I think it would just be nice to have some leniency on a smaller scale. So, like Ryan said, maybe there's 3 landowners that in the Catskill Mountains and cumulatively do own 150 acres. Maybe that's the bar that we set, or whatever that number is. They can get together and write their own management plan with a biologist from the state and come up with whatever's working for that 150 acres and let them do their thing. You know, if that's reducing those deer numbers down to 10 deer per square mile, that's great. Let them do it.
Well, landowners can do that now with a deer damage permit. There's nothing that stops it.
Well, the DMAP permits, but it's what is it, like 1 per 50 acres?
I'm talking about deer damage permits. That's completely different.
Oh, okay.
That's what we use on campus. Deer damage permits allow you to take deer outside of normal hunting season with bait at night with lights. All sorts of things can be authorized on a damage permit, but you got to be able to demonstrate the damage, which I assume if somebody's got adder plots out or measuring regeneration, they could make the case to DEC that I can't meet my management goals, I can't grow trees on my property, I should be authorized to have a damage permit. And I don't see any reason why a group of landowners couldn't get together and do that, or even an individual landowner could potentially do that.
Yeah. I think they can do that. The DMAP program, as far as I've read in multiple books, has failed. It's just failed. Connecting hunters to landowners has failed across the nation. We got to try something new. And, you know, I mean, the market matters. The market's more reflective of what people want. If they don't want to see deer killed commercially, they won't buy the venison. You know, I mean, I just don't see why we can't allow people more options. And at this point, what do we have to lose?
Yeah, but you got to tell that to the legislature because essentially they've got to change environmental conservation law to make that happen.
Yeah.
Until you can convince enough elected representatives or enough people get elected representatives on board, conservation law is not going to change.
Yeah, sure, but first we have to get our ducks in order, right? Because the wildlife people are not on the same page. This is a big fight right now, and they're not going to do anything if people can't even agree or have consensus in wildlife management. I mean, we have the North American model for wildlife conservation, who some guy named Geist invented, although I feel like he was just talking about public land and public resource, not private land and the wildlife resource. I think there's a mismatch there. But this guy just came up with this stuff, and we're just all going along with it. I think we need to start being a little more skeptical of this whole thing.
Well, you got to remember the North American model was written at a time when wildlife was scarce, and it was written in the early 1900s. Yeah. And so what the goal of the North American model is to provide fair and equitable access for a limited wildlife resource. Now we've passed that. We're way past that. We've got overabundant Canada geese. We've got overabundant deer in some areas. And the North American model doesn't really address those situations. Yeah. So what we've got to do is tweak the model to fit the new situation.
It also fails, as like Ruben Cantu said from Texas, it just doesn't mention private land. When that guy came up with it, I think his last name was Geist, I'm pretty sure.
Dr. Valerius Geist.
Yeah,
yes.
Geist was involved with it, definitely. And, but I don't think he was the only one that developed it. He's the one that sort of got notoriety for laying it out clearly with the 7 tenets.
Yeah. But it's got to remedy private land, and I feel like Texas has done a better job at that. They work more with landowners, Texas Parks and Recreation. They kind of have to because Texas is like 97% privately owned. Well, we got to do something here. We're 62% privately owned, and landowners are really the gatekeepers, and they're the habitat managers, whether they know it or not. Something's got to change.
No,
I don't know.
You're absolutely right. We're not going to have success unless landowners get involved because most of the deer in New York State still occur on private lands. There's no way around it. So landowners are going to have to be part of the solution and either, if they don't hunt themselves, figure out the way to get hunters on their property or figure out other creative ways to try to address the deer situation.
Yeah. If you're just tuning in, you're listening to From the Forest. Tonight's topic is managing deer and deer impacts with Cornell University's Dr. Paul Curtis. We got about a minute left, and what's something you'd like to get across to people about managing deer and deer impacts?
I think people should take away that no matter what you do, managing deer is not easy. We know the biology very well. It's the human dimensions aspects, what we're talking about, the social, political aspects that are the most challenging, and they're going to continue to be so. And so we've got to find a way to deal with some of these human dimensions issues to be more successful management on the ground.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, the deer issue is all-encompassing. It really is. It's political, it's economical, it's everything. Natural resources, it involves everything.
And like you said, white-tailed deer has got to be the most studied wildlife species out there.
Yeah, do you think that's true? I would bet.
I believe it's probably true, given the number of published studies on deer and the number that are still ongoing. It seems like every state's still got deer research underway, trying to look at something new and some new twist. But and we still haven't figured out what to do with urban deer. We've been talking about forest management, and when you start talking about suburban and urban deer, for example, Westchester County, Long Island, Rockland County, then you're going to have even more issues to bring to the table.
Yeah, wow. Well, thank you for coming on, Dr. Paul Curtis. We really appreciate it.
Glad to be involved with the show, and hopefully this was helpful for the listeners.
Absolutely. It should be archived by next week, and have a good night, and stay safe down there in Florida.
Okay, take care, Ryan, and hopefully be back up in New York State before too long.
All right, take care.
All right, bye now.
All right, if you just missed the show, tonight's show is Managing Deer and Deer Impacts with Cornell University's Dr. Paul Curtis, and that's all I got, John.
That's all I got. Good night, everyone.
All right, good night.
Oh, the neon lights were flashing and the icy wind did blow. The water seeped into his shoes and the drizzle turned to snow. His eyes were red, his hopes were dead, and the wine was running low. And the old man came home from the forest. His tears fell on the sidewalk as he stumbled in the street. A dozen faces stopped to stare, but no one stopped to speak. For his castle was a hallway and the bottle was his friend. And the old man stumbled in from the forest. Up a dark and dingy staircase the old man made his way. His ragged coat around him as upon his cot he lay. And he wondered how it happened that he'd ended up this way, getting lost like a fool in the forest. And as he lay there sleeping, a vision did appear. Upon his mantle shining the face of one so dear, who'd loved him in the springtime of a long-forgotten year, when the wildflowers did bloom in the forest. She touched his grizzled fingers and she called him by his name. And then he heard the joyful sound of children at their games, in an old house on a hillside in some forgotten town.